Hi everyone, I'm Ali Leetzy, Marketing Manager at Semperis, and I would like to thank you for joining our webinar today on picking the right type of solution for Active Directory backup and restore with Sandra Berkouwer and Darren Mar-Elia. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started today. Today's webinar is going to be recorded and the link will be shared with you in a few days. All attendees will remain on listen-only mode, and if you have any questions that you would like to ask one of our presenters, please feel free to post them using the webinar question tool, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. I'm going to pass the mic over to our presenters today.
Thank you, Ali. And good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. For me, it's a good evening because I'm in the Netherlands. I know for Darren, it's more of a good morning.
That's right.
And so just a short introduction from my point of view. I've not been a Microsoft MVP as long as Darren has, but I've been a 9-time Microsoft MVP for directory services and now enterprise mobility. And I've also been working closely with Veeam, who's also in the backup and restore space, and they've honored me with the Veeam Vanguard award for the last 3 years. And if people ask me about me, then the only thing that really comes out of my mouth is I'm an Active Directory aficionado. I really love Active Directory, Azure Active Directory, and I think I've done about everything with Active Directory there is to do. And yes, unfortunately, that includes decommissioning as well.
Yep. Thanks, Sander. It's good to be here with you. This is Darren Mar-Elia, Head of Product at Semperis, and 14-time Group Policy MVP, and more recently, Cloud and Data Center Management. Sander, I think you'll have a chance to catch up now as my Group Policy MVP came to an end this year. But I'm still happy to work in the Active Directory, Group Policy, Azure AD space, and really excited about talking about backup and recovery today. I've done a lot of years, both on the IT side and also on the enterprise software side. So I'm looking forward to digging in and chatting.
Well, I can safely say that we're all sorry to hear that you won't be an MVP anymore. So for all time's sake, let's reminisce about Active Directory. Let's do a short history of Active Directory, because the first Active Directory domain was actually raised about 20 years ago in Redmond. It was the Redmond domain from Microsoft, and it was Windows 2000 server. We didn't even call it Windows Server 2000 back then. It was Windows 2000 server. It was, I think it was actually called NT5 still back then. Beta 3. We had betas, no previews, just pure beta stuff.
Right.
That's when you got into Active Directory. That's when I sort of got into Active Directory. I think for me, it was about 4 years later when it was generally available for mere mortals, like I was back then. I was an MVP back then. No, that's just joking aside. But Active Directory was a tremendous step forward, because what we saw is that we saw the Kerberos protocol being embraced by Microsoft, embraced and extended to be complete, but it was an entirely new way of securing and still securing authentication and authorization for on-premises environments. But yet again, Kerberos is still, just like NGLM and NLM before it, protocols designed for the pre-internet era. So we didn't have claims back then. We didn't have any sort of the fancy stuff that we have today that well, I hope we get to talk about in a later webinar, but we'll see about that. But what we see is that Active Directory has always been that on-premises product. And it's not to say that it is now ancient, or it's now obsolete, or it's now stuff that you don't have to look at, because Active Directory throughout those 2 decades has been evolving and evolving into the product that, well, at least Darren and I love today. So we've got a short list when we just brainstormed about that. There's link value replication that really got us into a mode where we can have less bandwidth between domain controllers. That made Active Directory way more resilient than it was before that. We got protect against accidental deletion, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Read-only domain controllers, of course, in terms of security. Then in 2008 or 2, we got the Active Directory recycle bin, and not a lot of people know that because it took Microsoft some time to get a graphical user interface for that. But you could already use the Active Directory recycle bin in 2008 or 2. Then in 2012, we got domain controller cloning, which to me was a pure bundle of fun because I had something really wicked to present upon with Active Directory. And I think 2012 was actually a really major version of Active Directory in Windows Server. Then, of course, in 2012 R2, we got protected users and authentication policies, which is good fun, especially if you want to do something with privileged access or privileged admin workstations, the PAWS. And of course, in Windows Server 2016, we got group memberships, time to live. And if you combine that with Microsoft's Identity Manager, you can even have a Red Forest setup and have loads and loads of fun.
And one thing that we got early on, just going back in the history vaults a little bit, is that in the early days of Windows 2000, or actually before Windows 2000 shipped, there was no concept of SID history. Microsoft presented to large customers that the way you get from NT4 to AD was in-place upgrade, and that was the only supported method to get to AD if you had an existing NT4 environment. And people screamed loud and hard, and they essentially designed SID history and the ability to move SIDs from old domains to new as a result of that outcry from customers. So that was kind of an early development in Windows 2000 AD.
Oh yeah. Oh, grafting and pruning has always been the focal point of some MVPs in our group.
Lots of fun. Yeah.
Loads and loads of fun. Absolutely, absolutely. Now, if we go back about 2 decades, then there's a couple of things that we see happening with Active Directory. And the first one is that we saw virtualization come up. So all of a sudden, instead of having pizza boxes shoved into 19-inch racks and just filling up your data center, you could now have an extremely powerful box and have multiple servers running on that, and decoupling the operating system from the physical hardware. A lot of business people, of course, were touting that flexibility, the cost saving, the cost predictability, and we were basically promised by Microsoft to get domain controllers fast and move them without downtime between virtualization hosts. Well, the reality was more, and I can still remember the fun times we had in the forums where, well, I guess we were all just scanning for one word, which was Verona's true image. And if we ever saw someone mention that, then most often the situation was that they snapshotted the domain controller and lost them like snap, just like that. Because snapshotting and stuff like that, that's not something you want to do with any domain controller, be it virtual or a physical domain controller. And then, of course, there's the fun thing that virtualization also gives you less hardware dependencies. So Microsoft was saying, and VMware as well, were saying, you know what, you can quickly add, remove hardware and reduce outages. But you know what, this is a controller. I'm not using Windows Server version 1709 for domain controllers either, because they only have 18 months of support. My domain controllers typically have a longer lifespan than 18 months. So instead, what happens is that many virtualization admins would boot up a virtual machine that was a domain controller with a disk on the virtualization host itself, and then a separate disk with the Active Directory database on it, the NTDS did on it. And then all of a sudden there would be a network hiccup or a storage fabric failure or whatever, and the domain controllers would just lose access to its database and grind to a halt. So yeah, I'm safe to say that virtualization was and is still my favorite tool to hack and wreck Active Directory. And there's a famous quote from Benjamin Armstrong that I like to use for that. And he said, and he's, you know what? He's the principal program manager in the Hyper-V team. They had a big party today at campus because Hyper-V is 10 years old exactly today. But he said, if you can do Control-C, Control-V, you can hack Hyper-V. And you know what? And
That's awesome.
it's like that. If you have the disk of a domain controller, you have the domain controller. You just have to copy it off. You don't even have to close down a domain controller for that. You could if you wanted to have a good, consistent backup, but you don't have to. You can always do an IS-integ or something like that to test the integrity of the database. So yeah, we had a lot of fun with that. But I'm really curious about your mileage. So we have a quick poll, and I hope Ali can help us out with that. We were really wondering if any of you ran virtualized domain controllers before it was cool. Now, of course, that's a bit of a definition question, but if you were running domain controllers on virtualization hosts running VMware prior to version 3.5, I think we can safely say that you were doing it before it was cool.
So let's see if we get some responses here. Are we getting some votes?
We are. I'll wait a few more seconds.
And just keep in mind that it took Microsoft about 2 years after the launch of Hyper-V to get a knowledge base up and running that told you what not to do with domain controllers. And that was a fun time. And actually, that knowledge base, I think it's version 17 today. They've changed it up a lot. And of course, they had to do stuff with time synchronization mostly, because that's still a typical way of getting your network environment in an inconsistent state. But yeah, it was fun. So Ali, do we have some sort of an answer?
Seems like no is the biggest answer with 58%.
All right. So I think we have a lot of sensible Active Directory admins in our webinar. You don't say. All right, cool. Well done. Good job, guys. Let's go a bit more into the future, because not just virtualization happened when Active Directory was there, but there's also something that is the latest fad. So currently what we're seeing is organizations moving domain controllers to the cloud. Now, before you shut down your laptop and say, you know what, I don't want to hear this stuff, before you log out of this webinar, let's just see what's happening. So there are some organizations that are moving domain controllers, and of course, it's there's good business reasons to do that. You have pay as you go for compute, and you have the ultimate flexibility. But do we actually need that for Active Directory? It is a typically stable workload. If you have a domain controller, if you put logins on it, you'll see probably won't even see that much CPU spikes but well, there's some solutions that would. Memory usage is basically one flat line. So it is a very stable workload. And then, of course, Microsoft and Amazon are all saying, you know what, stick your domain controllers with us. They're safe. So they're saying you can trust our cloud. Well, at least Microsoft is saying you can trust our cloud. Amazon has a slightly different business justification for putting domain controllers in their cloud. But if you're sensible enough to do something with cloud, then you'll probably say, you know what? If I am going to do something with domain controllers and I am going to do something with the cloud, let's just put domain controllers in Azure and in AWS. So let's create VMs in both. Let's create networks. Let's just do it. You know what? It's all the same, right? Well, our buddy Vittorio had a good blog post about 2 weeks ago, and he said that multi-cloud strategies are not 100% multi-cloud. And I guess so he's approaching that from a developer point of view, but I'm seeing some other stuff as well, that multi-cloud is not 100% multi-cloud. There's knowledge involved, of specific knowledge of both platforms. There's APIs that are different. There's tools that's different. So there's a lot of differences. And
Yeah,
of
I
course,
agree.
yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
And I
Go
guess
ahead
the
and finish
main
your thought.
question is, why would you put your crown jewels in someone else's data center? Why would you give someone else the keys to your castle?
Yeah, and I have some experience with this in a prior life, and I think the main justification was that there were workloads, Linux and or Windows boxes that used AD for authentication and authorization that were running in these cloud environments, and they wanted to have domain controllers as close to them as possible. Partly because of performance at logon time, and partly for network resiliency, because in most of these typical scenarios, whether you're in Azure talking back to your on-prem AD via express route or using something like Direct Connect in AWS, your domain controllers or your access to domain controllers are only as good as those network connections. So being able to ensure that you always had authentication services available in your cloud VMs was one of the justifications for it. But it does add complexity, right? As you've said, you have domain controllers need to be able to talk back to their partners in on-prem world. I don't think I've seen anyone move all of their AD to the cloud. Maybe you have, Sander, but I haven't. So you're always going to have, or at least today, you always have on-prem domain controllers that you need to be able to reliably talk to. So it's not without challenges for sure.
Yeah, but you know what? Let's ask our audience. So we've got a second poll, and the question is: do you plan to move domain controllers to the public cloud, or have you moved them already? And I guess we'll soon find out. And you know what, Darren? I have seen some organizations state that in order to benefit most from Active Directory and virtualization, they wanted to 100% virtualize all of their VMs and all of their domain controllers. So
In
that
the
was
cloud.
fun. Well, no, just private cloud, that is.
Got it. Okay, yeah. That makes sense.
So, Ali, do we have a poll running?
Yes, we do. Let me share.
Oh, cool. Really looking forward to the answers. Although I guess, because the last poll already showed us that we have some really sensible Active Directory admins. Perhaps some people are taking a risk now. So let's see how that works out.
Yeah, it looks like the majority are staying on-prem, but we've got a decent minority that have moved them or are moving them. So that's interesting.
All right, and have they really truly enjoyed that, or are they wearing the scars and got the T-shirt?
We didn't get any wearing the scars, got the T-shirt. So maybe that means they're all
I'm so
happy.
glad.
I think that an interesting question. I think an interesting question would be: have you moved all of your DCs to the cloud? And I suspect the numbers would be a little different.
Well, that would be that might become a really good question at the end of the webinar. But
Yeah.
yeah, let's see if Ali has some time to grade that poll too. So we still have, and I'm really enjoying this audience. We really have some truly knowledgeable Active Directory people here. So yeah, let's dive a bit deeper into cloud, because what does it actually mean if you virtualize your domain controllers or move them to the cloud? So to me, there's a clear distinction between cloud the location and cloud the model, and I don't feel 100% that both the location and the model apply to Active Directory domain controllers. So yes, if you look at the location, then the cloud is just virtualization in someone's data center. It could be Microsoft's, and then you'll be guaranteed to run Hyper-V. It could be Amazon, and there's now vSphere on Amazon as well. So you can pick and choose your virtualization platform. But ultimately, the difference between private cloud and public cloud is that in private cloud, you can still shake hands with the virtualization admin if you really truly wanted to. And the big question, I think, is how do you back up your virtual and cloud domain controllers anyway? So backing up virtual domain controllers, that's something that we're doing already. Backing up your cloud domain controllers, there's a fun little there are two little tidbits that I'd like to share with you. And one is that, and this is something that I experienced in the field with a customer that was still running Active Directory in Windows Server 2003 functional mode. They didn't have the DFSR replication for Sysville yet, so they had for the file replication service, FRS, Windows NT4 replication. And they were having some trouble with Azure Site Recovery, and they have to do stuff with bird flags and stuff like that. And then you know what, it's something with replication. So we quickly figured it out, and then we talked to the product team and they said, no, we tested with Windows Server 2008, but we tested with clean installs on Windows Server 2008. And I was like, oh right, because if you install your Active Directory Windows Server 2008 from the get-go, you would have DFSR. But if it's a Windows 2000 server or Windows Server 2003 environment that was upgraded to Windows Server 2008, then you know what, this environment is still running FRS, and ASR will just crash on it. You will not have, you could not do test restores and restores with ASR if you still had FRS. And I think NetPow is doing a really good job on getting everyone over to DFSR and SMB3 and stuff like that. But there's still some environments that will likely get bitten by that. And the other one is that if you run your domain controllers in Azure, for instance, infrastructure as a service, then and you want to make backups with that with Azure Site Recovery, then only this week it is generally supported by Microsoft to do an Azure VM to Azure VM site recovery for those virtual machines just this week.
That's great.
Yeah, so we got that happening. Yeah, we got that going for us.
Yeah.
Yep. But I feel it's really important to have the right backup and restore solution for Active Directory, because there's a couple of potential problems. There's a couple of really dark clouds over your environment if you don't have a good solution. And there's two typical problems. So the first one is USN rollbacks. And if you improperly restore a domain controller, what could happen is you could have USN bubbles. And what happens in that case is that domain controllers automatically stop replicating to improperly restore domain controllers. So if you ever have a domain controllers that is just spewing errors like I'm not replicating and other domain controller, this domain controller is not responding, then you'll know that there's some stuff that you need to fix, because every domain controller will turn their back on improperly restored domain controllers, like a domain controller that was restored from a snapshot. And the other one is lingering objects. So if you have faulty replication beyond the tombstone lifetime, which is 60 days by default for Windows 2000 Server, Windows Server 2003, and 180 days by default for all the other environments that have been set up with newer Windows Server versions, then if you go beyond the tombstone lifetime, that might lead to unreliable deletion of objects. And that means that access may still be granted to that particular admin that you fired on the spot and had escorted out of the building by security. He just goes home, logs on to the VM, and if he hits that particular domain controller, he's still admin. Boom, we're in. And you're out. Now let's do a quick poll. Because I was wondering, so because we have so much experienced AD folks in our session, I was wondering if anyone ever experienced lingering objects in their environment. And we have a poll on that. And Ali, is it running?
Yes, I just launched it.
Cool. So I'm really keen on finding out if anyone was ever bit by lingering objects, or even with USN rollbacks for that matter, and have really punched their head into their desks, just wondering, why is this? How do I? Because I guess ultimately with lingering objects, that's the real question. How do I fix this? What domain controller has the truth on what object? And luckily, there's a tool for that now.
And I'd say that anyone that's ever rolled back a snapshot of a DC has experienced USN rollback.
Yeah.
In anything but a single DC environment.
Yep. And unfortunately, we still see those as well, but not in our audience, I'm sure. But yeah.
All right.
And then if you, of course, if you reboot it, then do a proper restore, then you'll see that it ultimately it will fixes up. But lingering objects is a real problem.
It's hard to get rid of those once you've got them.
Yep.
So we just shared the results, and it seems as though it's yes, solved it too. But
wow.
Yeah, 56%, but 38% of you said, heck no, I know what I'm doing.
Just as we experienced, yep. And since we're Active Directory admins, I guess we don't have friends of friends. So yeah, it all makes sense to me.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but lingering objects used to be a much bigger problem in older versions of Active Directory, as I recall. I can remember this coming up in the Active Dir forum all the time.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, and there's some good guidance as well. It's lengthy, but there's good guidance. And of course, there's a tool now, the lingering objects liquidator that you can use. And the abbreviation for that is typically, it's the same as laughing out loud. So it's LOL. So yeah, just fitting right there. Cool. So if you don't want USN rollbacks, and if you don't want lingering objects, then you need to have an Active Directory aware backup solution. And there's typically two types of backup solutions. So there's a host-based backup and restore solutions, and there's agent-based backup and restore solution. So the one is, and we'll go a bit deeper in that, but host-based backup solutions are typically for virtual domain controllers only. And of course, with the cloud rolling into our environments, we're also seeing solutions that back up and restore to on-premises repositories, but we're also seeing solutions that back up to cloud repositories and allow for restoration into the cloud provider's infrastructure as a service environment. But what really matters with a solution for Active Directory is that the solution needs to be Active Directory aware. It needs to know that the machine that it's backing up, the machine that it's restoring, is in fact a domain controller. Because if it doesn't do that, then what you'll see is that you'll end up with all kinds of problems. And of course, if you really want to be someone that's on top of his game, you need to be prepared. So yes, Microsoft has an Active Directory forced recovery guide. It is a bit lengthy. It's also online available. So if you didn't print it out and put it in a safe place and your data centers all burn down all at the same time, then you can also just read it on your mobile on the way over, on the train probably.
It's a light 75-page read.
Yeah, it's a light read. And then of course, because any backup and restore vendor doesn't want to stay behind on Microsoft, I believe every vendor has an even longer document that documents how to do a forced recovery with their solution. And I've seen documents with about 300 pages, which is really just spelling it out, literally. And of course, if you want to benefit the most from your Active Directory OS solution, you have to test and test again and test again and regularly and surprise people sometimes, because that's the only way to really get there, where if a disaster actually happens, that you won't experience it as a disaster, but just as any other test run.
And I want to just underscore this one, because what we see with our customers is, there's nowadays there's typically at least a couple different failure modes of Active Directory. So you have a logical failure of the service, but the servers themselves are still viable. And then you have what I would consider to be sort of a complete disaster, where, let's take, for example, malware happens to target and encrypt your AD domain controllers, whether physical or virtual. You end up with completely non-functional AD and non-functional servers. And so it's really important to test both of those scenarios with whatever backup and recovery solution you're using, because both of those are, at least these days, probably equally likely. I think we all recognize that a total AD meltdown is an infrequent event, but it's also, if it does happen, it's also a completely business ending event while the AD is down. And so being able to ensure that you can test under both of those scenarios is super important, I think.
Yes, and I've been talking to a couple of guys from Denmark that worked with Maersk, the shipping company. They actually had a total environment-wide ransomware attack and recovered from that in about 10 days.
Yeah,
they worked really hard to do that. Yep, and they found themselves unprepared. And even for an enterprise like that, I feel that's shocking. Yep, it is something that we can do better, I believe.
Yeah, and I think it underscores an assumption that a lot of people have, that if I'm backing up my machines, that's enough for example, AD. And there's so much more that goes into it, as you've described. You need a solution that's sort of AD aware, because of the complexities that a multi-master replicated database causes from a recovery perspective. There's also the issue of, is your backup solution backed up, right? Can you recover your backup and recovery solution in the first place? If all your backup servers are encrypted, that's not going to do you much good. So there's lots of those kinds of considerations.
Oh yeah, and what we're seeing too is that some backup and restore solutions actually integrate with Active Directory, because it's so neat and easy with group policy to distribute our backup agents, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, right. So if we're on the topic of host-based versus agent-based, let's just spit it out, because there's a couple of host-based solutions, there are a couple of agent-based solutions, there's hybrid as well. And what we're seeing is that some organizations are really benefiting of host-based solutions. So if you look at agent-based solutions, then there needs to be an agent on each and every domain controller. But if you have host-based solution, then you need fewer agents, fewer licenses, and it means fewer hassle. So that's one of the things why admins choose host-based solutions. And of course, there's bandwidth optimizations and all that kind of stuff. But ultimately, what it means is that if you create a host-based backup, you have to do a host-based restore. There's a couple of solutions that allow for physical restores, but they're not that resilient yet. And of course, if you have a virtualization platform where you're below the mark in terms of virtualization ratio, what you end up with, because host-based licenses um, clearly cost more than agents, then if your ratio is low, then you'll actually be spending more. This is something that we've seen companies do too, just spending more on host-based licenses than agent-based licenses because they didn't virtualize enough yet.
And it also sort of gets you, at least for some vendors, it gets you into the situation where you might have a different backup and restore solution for virtual servers versus physical, which may or may not be a good thing.
Oh yeah, oh absolutely, yep. Now if you look at agent-based solutions, then you can just push an agent anywhere. It doesn't matter if it's a virtual or physical domain controller. You can do that. And there's granularity of backing up. You can say, you know what, I don't want the entire disk. I just want this small piece of the server. You know what, just give me the registry, the system state. Well, system state is everything, right? Just give me the registry and the DIT, and I'll figure it out going forward. There's also the granularity of restores. So you can say, you know what, on my file server, I only want this folder to be restored because it was a project failed, something like that. I want to restore it. And most of the times what you see with agent-based solutions is that security is built in. And I've been discussing the way Semperis does that with security based on certificates, and it's really strong. And it also circumvents one of the drawbacks of agent-based solutions, because most of the time those security features are based on Active Directory. It's based on an account, it's based on a password, it's based on a service account, it's based on the password of the service account, stuff like that. If Active Directory is no longer there, then you can't restore. If all your backups are on a SAN, and that SAN is protected with IP security, IPsec, then that IPsec needs Active Directory for it to work. So without Active Directory, you might actually lose access to your backups. And of course, the quality of the agent is important. And because in an agent world, most of the times the agents are managed by a central repository and a central run server, what you'll see is that backups are sequential mostly. So your backup window just expands and expands as you add hosts to the backup server until, well, you know, you're no longer able to backup between 5 and 9. And of course, because we're talking about cloud, there's a couple of benefits of cloud-based solutions. So of course you have pay-as-you-go, and backups are stored offsite by definition. There's still companies and organizations that struggle with that still look for mean guys to wear the suitcase with their backup tapes to and from their premises. But with cloud-based backups, that's easy. It's because of the cloud model and because of the cloud location, it's offsite by definition. And as I stated before with Azure Site Recovery, it's really easy to do a test restore. It's really easy to deploy a typical part of your network through templates, for instance, in Azure IaaS, and say, you know what, I want to restore a couple of servers and test, I don't know, the effect of raising the domain function level on Exchange. You just deploy the domain controllers you need, you deploy the Exchange servers you need, you run it, you shut it down, you throw it away, and you only pay for like an hour of 2 hours or 2 hours of compute. And that makes it really cost efficient. But of course, there's also disadvantages of cloud-based backups, because if I create cloud-based backups of my on-premises domain controllers and my data center burns down, then where do I restore? There's the obvious reason, you know what, I'm just going to restore in IaaS, but that might not be the best location to do that, or the best model to do that in. And if you want to restore it on-prem, then the first thing that you have to do is copy the stuff in the cloud repository to an on-prem repository. You have to first build the on-prem repository, of course, but then replicate back in and then restore on-prem. And it just adds and adds and adds to your restore window. So I'm just wondering, because we've been discussing backup and restore for the last 10 minutes, and I really want to know if people went through the entire white paper for AD4's recovery solutions. So let's have another poll. Let's have some fun again. So Ali, if you could start the poll, then we'll find out.
Wonderful. Just launch the poll.
Would be really fun to see people actually starting over with their Active Directory domain controller, or at least a small business server. I could get that.
Fun is
Yeah.
relative.
Yep. And then of course there's the people that went through the 75-page white paper from Microsoft, went through the hundreds and hundreds of pages from vendors, and never had to put it to the test.
Yep.
Never were that silly, or had colleagues that were that silly to actually need it.
Better to be prepared.
Yep. But I've seen colleagues just, so what does this button do? That raises the force function level. Oh, is that a problem? Let me think. Oh, I've already done it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Gotta love those one-way operations that don't actually confirm confirm what you're doing.
And then stuff breaks and you have to restore the entire force.
Oh, yeah.
Yep. Good fun.
All right.
Good fun.
So we have our results, and it looks like 44% of our viewers said no, ain't nobody got time for that.
Yep. We have to create and delete users all day long. Yep. That's our job.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hardworking people. God, we love you. Perfect. Cool. Now, and I think I can relate where that comes from, because if you just deploy Microsoft's best practices, so today that means turn on the Active Directory recycle bin, because even Azure AD Connect whines about that. You haven't turned it on now. And of course, you select protect against accidental deletion for your beloved AD objects. So yeah, typically my manager is one that gets it. My account is one that gets the option. Typically OUs do, but there's a nice little caveat, because if you create an organizational unit with PowerShell, it does. If you create an organizational unit with CSVDE or LDIVDE, it doesn't. But of course, the best practices analyzer will show you that. And the tools that Microsoft gives you will help you with recovering objects. So yes, if you delete an object, then you can get it back, and the Active Directory recycle bin will give it back to you, including all its attributes, including group memberships and stuff like that, when you compare it to reactivating an account. But it's not as granular as any attribute that you want, any change that you want reverted. It is object-based, not attribute-based. And then, of course, test your Active Directory backups and restores. We've already been over that, but if you have a good Active Directory aware solution, test through all these scenarios. So test through a single attribute restore, an object restore, a domain controller restore, as Darren just told, because it was lost due to ransomware, and of course the entire forest. And that takes time. And both Darren and I know that. But what if? What if you could become really, really smart with your Active Directory backups and restore? And of course, now you're wondering, how the heck am I going to do that? So, Darren, I hope you're ready.
I'm ready.
Because I know your solution does exactly that. It is, I believe, the really smart solution to do that. And I'm gonna need to find the button, and it's right here. I'm gonna make you a presenter right now.
Cool. So let me go ahead and show my screen. And thanks, Sander, for that lovely setup. I'm going to just spend a few minutes. We've got, just a few minutes left, and I know that this is, we mostly wanted to just have a technical discussion, but I will show a little bit about what we do at Semperis. So that previous slide that Sander showed you the two solutions we have, which are DS Protector for AD and the Active Directory Forest Recovery. I'm going to focus on the Forest Recovery solution, which you should see on your screen, because we're talking about backup and recovery of the entire AD here, or major parts of it. Our DS Protector solution, the other product, allows for object and attribute level recovery. So we will track all changes happening to AD in near real time, show you the before and after value of those attributes that are changing and who's making the changes, and then give you the ability to revert those changes. But what I did want to do is talk a little bit about forest recovery. And with that, what you see on the screen is, I call it the dessert before dinner. This is the recovery panel, where you have three options that we provide for doing kind of like large scale recovery of Active Directory. So everything from an individual DC recovery to partition recovery. So let's say I had a massive deletion of 100,000 user objects. We could use our DS Protector utility to undelete those, but it may actually be faster to perform an authoritative restore of the entire domain partition. Or let's say it was the config partition and somebody had deleted all of the site and subnet objects using some crazy script. Same holds true there. I could potentially undo that using DS Protector, but it may be faster to do a partition level recovery. And so that's what we support here. And then the kind of big kahuna of the show is the full forest recovery. And so what I can do is I can select one of the backup sets that I've created with forest recovery. It's going to show me what backups on which DCs I have across my forest. And you'll see here I have multi-domain forest. And I can analyze this within the tool, and the tool will tell me what it's going to do to get me back to a fully functional forest. So it's either if I have DCs that I've backed up, I'll restore those from backup like these. If I have DCs that I haven't backed up, but I have my agent on them, then I'll be able to automatically re-promote those after I've brought the initial, what we call the mini forest, back from the restores. So I'll have essentially in parallel bring back all of the DCs across my domains in my forest back from my backups that I've kept, get back to a minimum level of functionality as quickly as possible for my AD. And that includes basically fixing up metadata automatically, so you don't have to go into NTDS util and remove domain controllers that aren't getting recovered because they're just the lost cause. Or the fix up of DNS to make sure that all your SRV records are clean for the DCs that are actually coming up, to rebuilding the global catalog. All of those tasks get taken care of automatically. As soon as I press this recover button, and it does have a prompt for confirmation, because it's obviously not something you want to do casually, but if needed, we can recover your forest in an automated fashion, all the way from having 0 domain controllers and just servers or VMs, up to a fully functional Active Directory service as quickly as possible. And depending on the size of the environment, anywhere from minutes to hours. Obviously, large multinational, globally distributed environments will take longer, but the goal is we do it in parallel. We bring up the backups first, get you back to a mini forest. And then we have neat little features like the ability to restore or re-promote from IFM. So if you're familiar with promotion from an IFM media, we will generate IFM automatically once we restore those first backups, and then use those IFMs to do the re-promotions of the additional DCs. So lots of cool features there. The ability to restore from one form factor, one hardware configuration to another, including going from physical to virtual, virtual to physical, could be in the cloud, could be on-prem virtual, doesn't matter. All of that capability. And then from a backup perspective, if I log out of my recovery console and drop into my administrative console, I have a way of quickly showing you the backups that we're doing. I can show you the backups that I've created, and we validate our backup sets to ensure that they're actually viable for a forest recovery. So these green check boxes mean that I can actually use this backup set for a forest recovery. I can distribute where the backups are held. So if I have regional DCs and I don't want to have to drag a backup across the network, I can get the backups close to the DC, and all that is done from the console. And I can deploy my agents and manage my agents for my DCs from the console. So it's sort of the best of both worlds from a agent versus host-based, in as much as you don't need every DC to have an agent on it. With the agent, it allows us to orchestrate the recovery of that DC, either from backup or via DC promo. If we don't have an agent on a DC, we just simply take it out of the metadata in Active Directory, and you can restore it at your leisure. And usually when we help customers deploy and plan a forest recovery scenario, we're trying to get to minimum viable service for the organization. So those tier 1, tier 2 apps that need Active Directory as quickly as possible and get that capacity up as quickly as possible. So with that, I'll sort of stop my dog and pony, and we can turn it over to, I think we'll have some questions maybe to ask, see if people have questions in the couple minutes we have left. So Allie, I don't know, do we have any questions that have popped up in the question dialogue?
Yeah, okay, great. So our first one is, are you saying that Microsoft's built-in tools are inadequate?
Yeah, so I mean, I think Sander may have an opinion about this, but I would say that, and he made this point earlier, that it's not sufficient to just back up a server from an Active Directory perspective. So all of the things that I talked about cleaning up metadata, about fixing up DNS, about rebuilding the global catalog, it's not just enough to restore from backup. You have to sort of acknowledge the multi-master replicated nature of AD and deal with the metadata, and that's covered in the Microsoft white paper, the forest recovery white paper, and that's basically what we used as a template for building an automated solution to handle all that fix up.
Yeah, one of the things that I noticed in the forest recovery console that you showed first is that there is no help button, there's no information button. If you look at all the other backup and restore solutions, if you're not sure how to restore a domain controller, you choose help, and then there's the hundreds and hundreds of pages of doing a forest recovery.
Right.
AFR just does it for you. There's no hassle there.
That's right.
It does all the magic, all the hard work, all the analysis. It does all that for you.
Yep.
There's one other thing though, because while here with the backup status and history, you said you can specify where backups are held, and we had a discussion earlier because one of the things that the DS Protector product does is that it has a backup on the domain controller itself, and I thought that was really interesting. So shall we
Yep.
expand on that a bit?
Yeah, sure. Actually, it's in the forced recovery, not in DS Protector, but it is that when we make a backup of a DC, we will cache, and you can configure this, we'll cache the latest backup on the DC itself. So, and in addition, we'll copy it to a distribution point. So the idea there is if remember my two failure scenarios, one is logical corruption of AD and the other is sort of physical corruption of AD. If I have only logical corruption of AD, meaning the server is still viable, but AD as a service is not, then it's a simple matter for our agent during that recovery process to simply take the backup that we have locally cached on the DC and use that instead of having to drag a backup across the network. And that's the sort of the value of that caching mechanism.
Yeah, because what you're seeing is that restore of a domain controller now becomes something that's like 5 or 10 minutes instead of hours.
Exactly. Yeah, that's very true.
All right.
Cool.
Do we have time for one more question?
Of course
Yeah,
we do.
let's do it.
All right, let's do it. Any thoughts on storing backups in a way they cannot be encrypted?
So I think that's, again, it's so this goes to sort of the planning around recovery. So for me, a backup needs to be inaccessible on the network to prevent it from being encrypted. And that can come in multiple forms. It could come as an offline tape backup. In other words, and we, even with our backups, we recommend that customers back up the backups and keep them off-site or offline. I think all of that is valid. It's basically those, even in the cloud, if you have a direct connection to from your on-prem network to your cloud network, and you're storing things in the cloud, if it's on a normal, Windows accessible file share in the cloud, it's potentially vulnerable. So I think, Sandra, you may have some opinions here, but I think that it's key to get it off the network, quote unquote.
Ultimately, yeah, but there's all kinds of considerations there. Yeah, as you mentioned.
Okay. I think we got the slides back up. So Sandra, you want to just wrap us up, and then I think we're good.
Yep. So we've done some questions and answers. Now, of course, if you have some more questions, if you want some more answers, then contact us. This is our contact information. If you want to know more about the Semperis tech, of course, you need to contact Darren. He's the head of product. If you want to know more about Active Directory horror stories or Active Directory fun, then contact Darren or me or the folks at Semperis. I think Ali just enjoyed this session as well, and she'll help you, and she'll help you out if you have questions on that too. So what we're doing in the next day is we'll send you a link to recording of this webinar, and you may expect that in a couple of days. Now, Semperis has also spawned a white paper that I wrote that details these strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats. So a full swing SWOT analysis for the types of Active Directory backup and restore solutions if you're looking for another solution. And we'll send you a link to that white paper. It's currently in post-processing. So I guess it's going to be available this month still. And in the meantime, if we can help you, just contact us.
All right, well, thank you so much, Sander and Darren, and thank you all for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks, Sander.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Take care.